Well, as the people stream in to this webinar today, let me begin by welcoming all of you. Let me begin by welcoming Areendam, Chanda, and Neha, Bairoliya, and also Bent Sorensen, who's the discussant for the paper today. This is the 20th CMI research webinar. We began this a little over a year ago, and we have had several successful webinars, each of them discussing research based on CMI's Consumer Pyramids Household Survey. Areendam has, along with his co-authors, written an excellent paper, and I will leave it to them to describe that to you. And Bent Sorensen will be discussing that. I will briefly introduce the authors first. So Areendam Chanda is assistant professor at Louisiana State University. He works in the area of long-term economic growth and productivity, regional economic growth, consumption and savings, and growth in India. He is the co-editor of Economic Inquiry and assistant editor of econometric modeling. He did his MA from Delhi School of Economics and then a PhD from Brown University. Neha Bairoliya is assistant professor at University of Southern California. So thank you very much, Neha, for taking this time out, because it's not even 6 o'clock in the morning at the other side of the earth when you are joining this. So a big thank you to you for doing this. Neha has a PhD from the University of Minnesota. We have a third author of the paper, Jiangyi Fang. I hope I am pronouncing her name correctly. She is a PhD student also at the University of Southern California. Bent Sorensen, the discussant today, is the lay professor of economics at University of Houston. He has a PhD from University of Copenhagen and was the associate editor of Econometric Theory, Journal of Business and Economic Statistics. And we just learned that Bent had been a teacher to Areendam Chanda. So this is a great meeting of teacher and student, and Bent will be commenting on Areendam and his co-authors' works today. So without much ado, I will hand over to Areendam and Neha to make their presentation. So just to explain before you begin, sorry, is that Neha, you have about an hour to make your presentation, and Bent then has about 30 minutes to make his comments. If anyone from the audience has questions, they can enter them in the Q&A. And if Areendam or Neha feel like answering on the spot, they may do that, or they can do it at the end. And the same will hold for Bent's presentation as well. So over to you, Neha.
Sounds good. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So first of all, a very big thanks to Mahesh and his team at CMIE for giving us such a wonderful platform to reach out a wide audience and talk about our paper. This is joint work with Areendam, who's in the room and would be answering the questions in chat, and Jiangyi Fang, who's a graduate student at University of Southern California. This paper, hopefully one of the many to follow, is the first one to look at, or we believe, consumption and savings behavior in India from a macroeconomic lens. So the starting point of the paper is the prediction of canonical life cycle models that individuals should smooth consumption over their life cycle. Now, there has been a lot of research in the past few decades trying to look at the predictions of the life cycle model in data. But most of this work has been concentrated in the US and other high-income countries like the UK. And empirically, what researchers have found is that this prediction does not hold. What we instead see in the data is this clear hump shape profile of consumption over the life cycle of an individual, which means that consumption grows in a significant way over the life cycle. Now, there are lots of explanations for why we don't observe this consumption smoothing behavior. Part of it is demographics, family size changes over the life cycle. It's also, access to annuity market, mortality risk, precautionary motive driven by incomplete markets and income risk. So there are lots of explanations why we see a hump-shaped profile of consumption. But like I said, most of this is concentrated in the US and other high-income countries. And there's a real paucity of research on low and middle-income countries trying to look at consumption smoothing behavior. The exception is China. So there is this inverted U-shaped savings profile in China, which is well documented. More recently, there was a paper on Malawi, which looks at consumption profile. And what they find is that for very poor countries, consumption is flat, but not because of smoothing behavior, but because it tracks income. So developing countries, and particularly large emerging economies like India and China, we believe with their varied socio-political environments and really very different family structures, provide a very interesting lens through which the predictions of the life cycle model can be tested. So that's kind of what motivated us into thinking about this work. In terms of this paper, so the paper has two parts. In the first part, we estimate these life cycle profiles of consumption, income, and savings rate for Indian households. And then we benchmark it with the US because a lot is known about US households. So we'd like to compare our profiles for Indian households and see how they fare against US households. And just to give you a sneak peek of our major findings, what we find is that Indian households show slower growth in consumption, albeit a comparable one when you look at US households. However, once you adjust for family size, all the growth in consumption for Indian household goes away, and what we observe is a flat profile, which is not the case for US households because we still see significant growth in household consumption even after adjusting for family size for US. And we also look at income, and we see that Indian households, they're not hand to mouth. They observe a significant growth in income over the life cycle, and the two facts together imply that they have a rising savings rate profile. So then we investigate whether these results are driven by specific subgroups, if it's particularly thinking about different family structures and whether they are driving these family structures or differences over region, like urban, rural, or different occupations. What we find is they also behave in a very similar way, and the flat profile stays. So in the second part of the paper, we investigate further this flat consumption profile once you adjust for family size and the rising savings rate. Now we lay out potential theories, and one candidate that emerges very strongly is this desire for lumpy investments in durable goods. Now, we do not observe exact expenditures on durables. However, short of that, we observe a lot of other interesting things like intentions and purchases of consumer durables over the life cycle. So we try to provide evidence of this demand for lumpy investments, which could potentially be depressing some of this growth in non-durable expenditures by documenting three supportive facts. First, we construct a life cycle profile of durable goods ownership, and we show that there is a very strong growth in the ownership of consumer durables over the life cycle. Second, we look at intentions to purchase these major durables and how they predict savings rate. And finally, we look at savings rate of households around the time of purchase of these consumer durables and see whether there are any patterns, and we do find very interesting changes in savings rate around durables purchase. So in terms of our contribution to existing research, this paper makes a contribution to the vast literature on consumption smoothing behavior, which is mostly concentrated on US. But I'm not going to talk about that today, rather try to think about the research in terms of India. So if you look at existing research on consumption and savings behavior in India, if you look at the prior literature, most of the papers, most of the research is focused or has a more applied micro focus, looking at risk sharing mechanisms, insurance mechanism. And in terms of their macroeconomic predictions, they are very limited. So some of these papers, they are looking at very specific channels, or looking at dowry, for instance, or presence of intergenerational households. But it's the data sets that they utilize are usually very small surveys, which are not representative of the economy as a whole. In terms of limited micro-founded macro research, there have been a few papers in the recent times which are looking at household behavior from a more macroeconomic lens. For example, Bairoliya and co-authors, they look at asset accumulation, and they find that 77% of assets for Indian households in real estate, and it does not change very much over the life cycle. Gopalakrishnan and co-authors, they utilize rainfall shocks and the same data set to show that households engage in financial savings in the short run, and they accumulate physical assets in the long run, which is somewhat consistent with the story that we are trying to put together in this paper. There's also a nice paper by Hinat Kowaska and co-authors. They look at convergence in savings rate across different caste subgroups, but also they're only utilizing the wage data. So of course, our paper contributes to several strands of the literature, but primarily we think that it fills an important gap in the macro literature looking at consumption and savings behavior. And we think it can have valuable contributions along those lines. So let me walk you quickly through the data and our estimation techniques. So the first data set we utilize for India is, of course, Consumer Pyramids Household Survey. Now, a lot of you probably already know this data set, but just to kind of give you a quick idea about why this is super important and the right data set for us. First of all, it's a longitudinal survey. So, households are tracked over time. So we can not only make conclusions about, the similar conclusions that researchers can using repeated cross-sections, but we also can look at changes in behavior and look at how households are changing behavior over time. And it's a large sample of households, over 175,000 and counting. And the frequency is pretty good because households are surveyed every 4 months, and it covers 90% of the population. Now, we think that this is really a great feature of the data, given that India is a very diverse country with a very large population. This data set is very extensive. So there are modules on consumption expenditures. Now, when I say consumption expenditures, these are primarily non-durable expenditures on goods and services. We also observe income, which is a very cool feature of this data, because the existing other surveys do not really have income data. So we think that this can really, this is very valuable. There are indicators for assets and liabilities, ownership, purchases and intentions, and of course, demographics. And you would see that we're going to be utilizing a lot of this information today. So we start the data set, it starts in 2014, and we utilize it until 2019. This gives us a lot of waves, and we can observe households for a longer period of time. This data set has been very widely utilized now, and there is an explosion of papers which are using this data set. So clearly, it's a very good data set to look at for some studies. The other data set that we look at is for US. It's the panel study of income dynamics. Now, PSID is, of course, not that large in terms of its scope. It samples 5,000 households in the US. It goes back all the way to 1968. However, this is one of the most widely used data set for micro and macro studies on the US. The households are tracked over time as well, and it includes lots of rich information on employment, income, wealth, expenditures, demographics, family dynamics, so on and so forth. Consumption data was collected, starting late 1990s. And to be consistent with our categories of expenditures that are available in CPHS, we use data from 2005 onwards, even though this survey actually goes back to 1968, but the consumption data is not available at that time. So we're going to be very careful in trying to be very consistent between the two surveys in terms of what measures we're looking at of expenditure categories. So like I mentioned, it's going to be all non-durable expenditures on goods and services. Even though PSID reports some durable expenditures, we are going to net it out from total expenditures to be consistent. We're going to be looking at household heads between ages 24 and 69, again, to be consistent between the two surveys. For India, we're going to deflate the expenditures using state, urban, and rural CPI. For US, we're just going to use the regular consumer price index. So to give you kind of an overview of the two surveys, all the Indian values are converted using PPP US dollar. The mean age of household head is comparable in the two surveys. It's a little bit on the older side for Indian households. The expenditures, of course, in level terms are much lower, and these are all annual expenditures. What is interesting for me is how different some of these expenditure shares are. So if you look at food expenditures, for instance, it forms a much larger share of total non-durable expenditures in India than it does in the US. It's 54% of the expenditures. Non-mortgage housing, which is rent or anything related to housing which is not mortgage, is comparable. It's not historically different. Transport, however, is, and this is, again, we've tried to be careful to only include the non-durable expenditures related to transport, and it's much larger when you look at the US in terms of its share. Education, not surprisingly, and health, of course, it's well known that health expenditures are pretty large in the US. So we feel that these expenditure shares are quite interesting and how some of these are very different. So coming to the estimation technique. So the equation that we would like to estimate is something like this partially linear regression model. So we have log consumption on the left-hand side, and we would like to see how this consumption changes over the life cycle. So the main object of interest here is the age profile of households. Now, for this first part of the paper, we're going to follow work by Angus Deaton, Fernando Villaverde, and Kruger, and going to treat our data set as repeated cross-sections. We're not going to utilize the panel aspect of the data in the first part of the paper. So what we're going to do is we're going to construct these pseudo panels for each country, US and India. And in these pseudo panel, each outcome is going to be a weighted sample mean of birth cohort I at time t. Right? And the birth cohort, we're looking at the age of the household head, and time is every 4 months, which is the recorded wave in CPHS data. Now, there are two components in terms of estimation. The first component is the parametric part, which is the cohort and time dummies that we would like to estimate. And this is generally estimated using ordinary least squares regression. And the first part, which is the part of real interest, is the smooth function of age. Now, we would like to estimate this part non-parametrically to allow a very flexible framework. And together, we're going to estimate this entire regression model semi-parametrically, where some of it is estimated using OLS and the other is estimated non-parametrically. In short, we are going to use the Robinson estimator for estimating this regression model. So let me show you what we find. So this is total non-durable household consumption expenditures for both Indian and US households. What do we find? Well, the first thing is they're both growing, right? So we see about a 50% growth in non-durable expenditures for US households and about like 38% growth Now, of course, the growth for Indian households, it's smaller, but it's comparable, right? And it's a little bit slower. US households, if you look at the data, actually exhibit higher growth. If you look at PSIT, it's about more than 60% growth. But like I mentioned earlier, we are trying to be very careful about measuring categories which are similar across both surveys. So we're only looking at the dotted line, a dashed line, which is similar categories of expenditures as those available in CPHS. So the first thing we notice, okay, Indian households don't seem that different, right? They have comparable growth. The other question that comes to mind is, well, the family dynamics are very different in the two countries. The evolution of family is very different. The number of kids, the number of members, these things are very different. And these profiles are masking some of these differences. Well, family sizes, are they different? Well, that's an emphatic yes. The two countries have very different family structures, and these pictures are evidence towards that. So the first panel is about the family size, just the number of family members. The blue bars are for India, and the orange bars are for the US. So we see that the number of members, if you just look at the number of members, it's roughly twice that of the US for an average Indian household. The right panel is children. So if you look at the distribution of children over the life cycle of households, we see initially there is a hump, and which is similar for both US and Indian households. Children appear as the household head ages, and there are presence of children. And then if you look at the US household, it goes down.
Neha, 1 second. I think there's one question that came up. If you go back to the previous graph, and just explain what's on the y-axis, that would be helpful.
For sure.
Thanks.
And yeah, thanks for the question. So what we're doing is we are normalizing expenditures with respect to age 24, right? So age 24 consumption expenditures equals 1 in both countries. So we're not doing any levels comparison. We are only looking at the growth in expenditures for each country with respect to age 24, right? So age 24 is 1. And so for the US, it means that around age 50, there is a 50% growth in expenditures for US households, and there is about a, let's say, 38% growth in non-durable expenditures for Indian households, right? So going back to children and how they are different in the two countries, like I said, initially they look very similar, but later on, US households, the probability of having children or the average number of children goes down. Of course, children grow up, they leave the household, and that's about it. But for Indian households, there's another smaller peak that we observe. And what's happening? Well, these are the grandchildren, right, in extended families, because a lot of Indian households are living in extended family setup where there are, your kids and their spouses and their children are all living together. So we do see that these differences are stark, both in the size and the composition. And it's important to take that into account. How do we do that? Well, first, the equation of interest now would be this adjusted consumption, where NIT is the denominator that we're adjusting with is the equivalence scale. Why equivalence scale? Well, one thing we could simply do is just divide by the number of family members, right? But there's an extensive literature showing that there are returns to scale, then there are multiple household members, and if there are 2 members, they don't cost twice as much consumption, right? So there are multiple ways of adjusting household consumption for family size. We use 2 different approaches, which are very widely used. One is the OECD adult equivalence scale, which is this linear scale in the number of adults and the number of kids. So it puts a weight of 0.5 to each additional adult other than the household head, and 0.3 for each kid present in the household. The other scale we use is the one proposed by National Research Council, and then it's also adopted in the research, and people have used it. It's a nonlinear scale. So it's a little bit different, and it assigns a slightly different weight to the kids. So just to give you an idea how these scales are different, because the denominator is important, the adjustment is important, right? How you're adjusting for this family size. So if there's a family size of 1, Doesn't matter, right? All the scales, everything would be the same. If there's a family size of 2, and these are all 2 adults, then clearly the OECD scale is somewhat different. So if the OECD scale suggests that 2 adults cost 1.5 times the consumption, the NRC scale would suggest that it's a little bit more than 1.5, it's 1.6. And the presence of children, of course, changes that. And as you go on increasing the number of adults, the scale changes. So you can see that there are differences, which could potentially mean that the adjustment matters, right? Let's look at the profiles once we do the adjustment. So we do the adjustment, we re-estimate, again, using non-parametric estimation techniques for age. So this is the adjusted consumption expenditure growth for both US and India. We find that once you adjust for family size, there's a significant decline in growth, right, for US households from all the way to 50%. Now it's about 35% growth in consumption expenditures. What do we see for Indian households? Well, no matter what adjustment you do, it looks like a flat consumption profile. Of course, if it's the NRC scale, there's a little bit more growth. But for all practical purposes, this is nothing compared to the residual growth that we observe for US households. So just to kind of summarize what I have talked about so far, if you look at non-durable expenditures and compare that between US and American households, what we observe is Indian households have comparable growth in these total non-durable expenditures. If you look at the household life cycle, 36% 50 versus 50% for US households, right? But once you adjust for family size, and it does not really matter very much how you adjust for it, what we find is most of the growth for Indian household goes away, even though we observe a lot of the residual growth still for US households. It's only 3%, that's the growth in the consumption that we observe once we adjust for family size. So could we say that this flat consumption is driven by certain subgroups and that's dominating the average behavior? Well, let's look at some of this heterogeneity. So the first source of heterogeneity that comes to mind is the differences in family structure, right? Nuclear families are very different from extended families. Now, what I mean by nuclear families are families where you have a household head, their spouse, and their non-married children. Any other household with any other member would be termed as an extended family in our sample. We observe very, very similar results for both family setup in terms of growth and consumption. In fact, when we look at extended families, what we observe is total household consumption grows, but once you adjust for family size, it's an interesting inverted U shape. So there's absolutely no growth in expenditures for either households, either of the two types of household once you adjust for family size. So it doesn't seem like it's a story of one household or the other, at least when you look at family type. What about urban versus rural? When we look at urban households, clearly they have a much higher growth in consumption, and it's very comparable to that of US households. But again, once you adjust for family size, most of that growth goes away. So you do observe about a 10% growth in adjusted expenditures. But again, given that these urban households on an aggregate have comparable growth to that of the US, it's quite surprising how much of the growth gets depressed once you adjust for family size. What about different types of occupations? Are farming households similar to households where the head is a white-collar worker or self-employed? Because these look very different, or their behavior should be very different. Yes, you do see a lot of heterogeneity and the evolution of consumption. But when it comes to the flat profile, we still observe the same flat consumption expenditure profile for all these different households once you adjust for family size, which is your right panel over here. So the bottom line is it does not seem like the flat consumption profile after adjusting for demographics is driven by a particular subgroup of Indian households. It seems like that's consistently the story for India. We also looked at different categories of expenditures, which are, like food and transportation, non-mortgage housing, whether some of these categories are more important than the others. And for those of us who have done some work on the US, we know that education and health seem to play a very important role in the overall expenditure share. So we look at it another way. Well, let's net out expenditures on education and health, and let's see if we find any different results, because it could be that most of the growth in for US households is driven by education and health expenditures, which we don't observe, at least not on a similar level for Indian households. The story stays the same, doesn't matter. So the rest of the paper is trying to understand why we observe a flat non-durable expenditure profile for Indian households once we adjust for family size. Hopefully I've convinced you that this is a robust fact that we observe for different subgroups for overall India, and it's worth exploring further. So the first hypothesis that comes to mind is the most obvious one. Are Indian households able to smooth consumption? So there is nothing surprising about their flat profile. They are perfectly smoothing consumption. But if we know something from the research, existing research, we know that if there is uncertainty about future income in the light of incomplete markets, that would imply that consumption is not smooth, but we see a hump as we see in the case of the US, right? So if Indian households are really smoothing consumption, do we see a lot of borrowing going on? Are young households borrowing against future income? It's highly unlikely. If you look at the debt to asset ratio for US, it's much higher than Indian households. For Indian households, it's about 3 to 4%, depending on whether you're looking at urban or rural areas, and it's 15% for the US households. Now in the survey, we cannot really look at the intensive margin of debt because we don't have that data, but we can look at the extensive margin quite a lot. And we do look at borrowings, and we see whether these young households are borrowing a lot. There's no clear pattern. There is a little bit of a growth in borrowings, but it's not nearly enough to justify a flat consumption profile. We look at different sources of borrowings, like borrowing for non-durable consumption, borrowing from your local shops. We don't see any clear patterns. First of all, these levels are very low. And on top of that, there is no significant growth over the life cycle, which, if you believe the permanent income hypothesis, the standard life cycle theory, would mean that these households are borrowing a lot early on. It doesn't seem like that's the case. So we can safely rule out consumption smoothing behavior as a justification for the flat profile. The other alternate could be the exact opposite. Indian households are severely borrowing constrained. And in fact, they are just consuming their income every period, which just exhibits no growth. So kind of the story like we saw about Malawi. They're hand to mouth, there is no growth, and that's it. Well, the interesting thing here is we can test this in the data because we have income information for the household, and not just for the household, but also for every member of the household, which we can use later for further robustness checks. So let's look at the income and let's see what's going on. So when we look at household income and how it changes over the life cycle, again, in all these pictures, we're normalizing with respect to age 24. Age 24 is one, because what we're interested in is the growth. We're not interested in how the level changes, but how much is the growth over the life cycle. Now we see about 100, quite a substantial growth for US households, and it's not surprising. Prior research has documented that. It grows, it almost doubles. What about for Indian households? On an average, we see growth which is fairly comparable to that of the US. But now, again, the question is, how much of it is driven by the fact there are lots of workers, there are large families, and how much of it is really productivity growth? Again, we can look at that because we have the working status, the occupation of every household member. And once we make an adjustment, and the adjustment is, looking at household income per working member, of course, the US picture doesn't change much, but the Indian picture does change a lot. The growth does go down. It's about a 20% growth once we control for the participation margin. So this picture is telling you that, yes, on an aggregate, there is a lot of growth in household income, but a lot of it is driven by participation and not productivity growth. Nevertheless, there is a lot of income growth that is comparable to that of the US. There is lots of interesting heterogeneity, but the answer does not change. Some areas experience, some subgroups experience an even higher growth than the US. For example, urban India, there is a massive growth in income over the life cycle. So our paper goes into a lot more detail about looking at adjusted income growth, but here's a summary of what we find in terms of income. We find comparable growth of household income to that of the US, right? This high growth is true for all subgroups. It's not driven by urban India. We observe that in all the subgroups that we look at. Of course, in urban India, it's 220%, but still, even in extended families, we observe a non-trivial growth in household income. We find that a lot of the growth is driven by labor force participation. As household members grow older, they join the workforce and there are more bodies working. Part of it is driven by productivity growth. How much of it is driven by productivity growth differs by subgroups. For example, if you look at urban India, it's roughly half and half. So clearly we can rule out the second hypothesis that these are households which are basically consuming their income and their income is not exhibiting any growth. There is a lot of growth in income for sure. The final hypothesis that we would like to explore and which kind of emerges as a potential candidate is, what if there are financial frictions combined with a demand for lumpy investment in these durable goods or physical assets, which means that the desire to save is much greater and that could be depressing the non-durable consumption. Now, the best thing to test this hypothesis would be if we could observe expenditures on durables, which we unfortunately did not. However, short of that, we observe a lot of different features. We observe actual purchases of durables, intentions to purchase them. And in the remaining part of the paper, we are going to be utilizing that information to provide some evidence on that. But before I do that, let me show you some savings profile for Indian households over the life cycle. Now, the way I define savings is income net of non-durable expenditures. And I'll just tell you a little bit why this is important. So first of all, when you look at income net of non-durable expenditures, you see that for all different subgroups, as well as for India as a whole, there is a very, very large increase in savings rate. Depending on the subgroup that you're looking at, savings grow by 25 to 35% percentage points over the life cycle. And the second important thing is it stays consistently positive. Even early on, households are not just saving, rather the savings remain positive. Why is that important? Well, let's think about it. If savings rate are increasing, one might ask, well, that is supportive of the life cycle permanent income hypothesis story, right? However, the fact that they're consistently positive shows that it cannot be the case. If it's really households are smoothing consumption, there should be, like I said, a lot of borrowing going on, or initially they should have a negative savings rate, which we do not observe. We see that no matter which subgroup you look at, households are consistently saving and building the stock of capital over the life cycle. Now, let's explore the third hypothesis a little bit more, the demand for lumpy physical assets. And the reason why we think about this is because there is, of course, a large literature looking at physical assets or consumer durables, which serve two purposes. One is, of course, there is a utility flow. So you like having a car, you like having a house, but also these durables can act as collateralizable assets. And at times, you, of course, can use them as collateral. So we're going to explore that channel. And again, we are going to look at it multiple different ways. First, we are going to construct a life cycle profile of durables ownership index because we have a physical inventory of every single durable that households own, or a majority of them. So we can look at how this ownership changes. Second, we do observe intentions to purchase durables within a very tight window of 4 calendar months. So we're going to utilize some of this information to see how savings rate differ by intentions to purchase these durables. Are households really saving if they report that they are intending to purchase these durables down the line? And finally, we're going to look at actual purchases and how savings rate vary around the actual purchases. So hopefully these three things together should be able to convince you a little bit that demand for lumpy physical assets is one of the key drivers of a flat consumption profile, and why this demand could be depressing non-durable expenditures over the life cycle. Okay, so first we construct this durable goods ownership index. What we do is we look at running inventory of all the assets, all the physical assets that households own. We aggregate them up, but of course, just aggregating them up would not make sense because different durables have different weights. Now, there are different ways of assigning these weights. We tried principal component analysis, but it yielded similar results to an index that I'm going to show you today, which is also more intuitive. So this goes to the work by Karmakar and Narayanan. What this index does is assigns relatively higher weight to durables which are less widely held. So in the context of Indian households, actually a house will have a lower weight compared to a car or an air conditioner, because an air conditioner would be less widely held than a house. Okay, and of course for Indian households, 90% of them own a house. So we find that this is a very intuitive index, a way of weighting, and we compute a weighted index of durable goods ownership, and then redo our non-parametric estimation with respect to age. Again, everything is normalized with respect to age 24, because in this paper, of course, we're not interested in levels, but the growth. What do we see? We see an 80% growth in this index over the life cycle, which is pretty substantial. So early on, people start with a low collection of these physical assets, and they build pretty quickly. Now, what this picture is telling us that there is some merit to the story that there is a demand for durables. Households demand these lumpy investments in consumer durables because we see them building the stock pretty quickly, and which stays after age 50, it stays at a high level. We look at heterogeneity again, because we're interested in trying to make ourselves sure that this is not a story of a certain subgroup, but it's a story of overall India. And that's the case. For every subgroup that we look at, we see that this durable goods index it grows pretty quickly over the life cycle, which seems to be consistent with their savings behavior and the lumpy investment motive for the rising savings rate. Next, we look at intentions. A good thing about this survey is households report their intentions to purchase a particular consumer durable over a very short period of 4 months. Now, it's a very tight window, and it's not a long horizon plan, but it's a very short window, but it can give us a sense of whether these intentions are predictive of savings rate. So then we estimate the following equation, and this is where we really utilize the panel aspect of our survey. So in this equation, we have savings rate of household I in period T, or wave T, as the outcome variable. And the object of interest is this variable ZIT, which is the reported intention to purchase durable good J by household I at time T. So are they responding a yes or a no in terms of their intentions to purchase, let's say, a refrigerator or a two-wheeler or a car, right? And we want to see how that impacts the savings rate. So the beta J is the object of interest over here. And then we have a whole bunch of controls. What do we find? Well, the columns here are the same regressions, but with increasing number of controls. The fourth column is the one with all the controls like time and cohort dummies, age polynomial, education, the existing, a durable goods ownership index of the households. And we find that even with all these controls, there is a very strong statistically significant impact of these intentions to buy durables like house, car, two-wheelers, tractors, and cattle on savings rate. So just to give you one number, if households are reporting an intention to buy a house, their savings rate for these households are anywhere between 4 to 10 percentage points higher than households that are reporting no to their intentions. So intentions we do observe a very strong correlation between intentions and savings rate. And it's not just true for house, but a majority of these durables. Now there is we redo this analysis by looking at different regions, and some of these are more important for urban areas, and some of these are more important for rural areas. For example, if we looked at urban areas, car is very, very strongly predictive of savings rate. But if we looked at rural areas, then tractor and cattle seem to play a much larger and important role. So then again, to kind of summarize what we see in terms of intentions, even with a bunch of controls, we find that intentions are predictive of higher savings rate. And it varies in terms of its quantitative importance, but they tend to predict higher savings rate in a significant way. We also redo our analysis with a bunch of other minor durable goods and find similar results. And of course, these are available in the paper for interested readers. We try it with different household types, like I said, in urban areas, rural areas, extended families, nuclear families, different occupations. We find similar results. These are very robustly predictive of savings rate. Finally, we observe actual purchases. So we don't only have to rely on intentions, because it's a panel starting all the way in 2014 and going all the way to 2019. Well, that's the scope of our subscription and our survey. We can observe households making these actual purchases. And this is not reported, or this is not something that we have to infer. We see them making purchases in the data. So we can see how the savings rate changes around this purchase event horizon. So we're estimating this equation where, again, the outcome variable of interest is our savings rate. ZIT now is the distance of the purchase from the time at which we are measuring the savings rate. So for example, let's say tau is your period in which you are making the purchase. So a period before this purchase event, ZIT would be -1, right? In the actual period of the purchase, ZIT would be 0. So it's really measuring your distance from the purchase and looking at how savings rate changes if you're looking at this whole time period around the purchase. And again, we have a vector of controls and basic controls that we've been using all throughout our analysis, like age of the head, wealth controls, education, so on and so forth. What do we find? Well, we find that there is a significant variation in savings rate in the sense that for most categories, households build up their savings all the way to the purchase, and then there is a big decline in savings. And the favorite picture is for the house, because you see that you buy a house and then you start just saving a little bit. You observe that for tractor and cattle, and to some extent, you see these patterns happening for all major durable goods. Households build up their savings, and then there is a decline in savings rate, which is also similar to saying that they're building up their wealth index and they have a lot of wealth, and then they start drawing down on their wealth because they have already purchased the durable that they wanted to. So we do a whole bunch of robustness tests. So this is what we find. We find that Indian households exhibit a flat consumption profile once we adjust for family size. And investment in lumpy durables seem to be at least somewhat of a driver or instrumental in depressing non-durable consumption profiles for Indian households. So we conduct a bunch of robustness exercise. The one that is extremely important for us is the definition of the household head itself, right? What if the reported head or the way people think about the household head is different at different points in the life cycle? What if, early on in the household's life cycle, the head is more synonymous with a financial head, and later on it's more a figurative head, and that could really affect the way we are thinking about these life cycle profiles. So we conduct a robustness exercise where we designate the highest earner of the household as the head and not the reported head. This is where we utilize another cool feature of the data, which is we not only observe total household income, but income of every member. So we can figure out who the highest earning member of the household is. Now, we do that, and we find that there is actually a large overlap between the reported head and the actual financial head that we construct. And this is the table showing what fraction of primary earning members or the highest earning members are also reported heads in the sample. On an average, 78%, which we think is a pretty large number. And of course, if you look at nuclear families, white-collar workers, this number is even higher. So let's see what we find when we redo our definition of household head, when we consider only heads which are also financial heads. Nothing changes. Nothing changes in terms of the growth in non-durable consumption expenditures, both adjusted and unadjusted. The thing that changes is the decline. There's a much sharper decline later on, depending on whether we're looking at the figurative head or a financial head. If it's really a financial head at later on, we see that consumption declines. But to our story, grows, aggregate consumption grows over the life cycle, but once you adjust for family, it does not, it's a flat line. Nothing changes, even when you redefine your household head. The other question, which again, I think is super important to think about, is home production. What if there's a lot of home production going on in Indian households, which is not captured in the expenditure measures? So what we're seeing as a flat profile of consumption is really a flat profile of expenditures, and there is a lot of home production going on in the middle of the life cycle. While we cannot directly observe this home production, it's very hard to get estimates of home production. The data, the survey reports imputed income, which is really a similar idea as home production. So it reports, different types of home production, like, are you borrowing from your own shop? If you are a shop, if you have a grocery store, are you borrowing from that grocery store and using that? Because of course that would not be reflected in the expenditures. So there are lots of different measures like that. We take all this imputed measure of income and add that to the consumption expenditures to account for home production. It's not perfect, but at least it should give us somewhat of an idea whether this is going to play an important role. We find that overall the levels of these values are very small in terms of in relation to the total non-durable expenditures. Of course, there's a lot more home production going on in rural areas than urban areas. But we add this home production or this imputed value of home production to expenditures. We re-estimate consumption profiles. What do we find? Absolutely no effect. And finally, we say, well, we're doing this non-parametric estimation with respect to age. What kind of results are we going to get if we just utilize very, very simple framework like, a parametric family of functions and age? Doesn't really change much. So the type of estimation that we're doing is not really key here to determining our key result. We find that no matter what you do, even if you use very, very simple framework where you have a third order polynomial of age or a fourth order polynomial of age, even in this parametric class of families, we see that it does not change much. aggregate consumption in India grows anywhere between 33 to 36% over the life cycle. But once you adjust for family, it's a flat profile. That's what we find. No matter how we look at it, no matter which subgroup we look at, no matter which expenditure categories we look at. So with that, I'm going to end my discussion of the paper, but just to give you a summary, something to take home with you. What do we do in this paper? What do we find, and what do we think is very interesting and important? We find that unlike the US households, Indian households show a flat consumption when we adjust for family size. And like I said, seems like a super robust finding. It doesn't seem to be driven by lack of income growth, because Indian households do observe a lot of growth in income. And there is, in fact, a substantial rise in savings rate over the life cycle. So Indian households are not really smoothing consumption in the traditional life cycle perfect market sense. There seems to be something else going on. And hopefully I have convinced you, at least to some extent, that this behavior is partly driven by the need to save for lumpy investments. Because households desire these physical assets, there are credit constraints. Not a large number of these households have access to credit market. We've looked at these things actually. You can also see whether households are borrowing to finance these durable purchases. No, they're saving. On an average, they're saving, they're accumulating a bunch of wealth so that they can purchase these lumpy investment goods. And that seems to be depressing their growth in non-durable expenditures. So that's kind of what we find in this paper. And I would be extremely happy to hear any comments or feedback.
Thank you, Neha. That was really a fantastic presentation for a great piece of work. But I think it will be best for us to leave it to Bent to comment on this. I was truly impressed by the amount of work done, the amount of rigor that you have put in this, but it's best for us to hear. Bent, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for asking me to discuss this paper. I'll share my screen now. So you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So, so this is like a half-hour discussion, which is pretty long. So, so I'll be partly nerdy and partly give some of my own taste. And of course, the most important thing is you take it in the constructive way. It's meant that it's going to try and help you get it published. So I'm not talking so much about what's good, but what I think could be improved, right? That's my job. So here we go. So the paper focuses a lot on plotting life cycle profiles for Indian households, as we saw. And it uses a very large consumer panel, right? It's a very impressive size data set. So I am a little bit confused about the statement that it covers 90% of the Indian population. I mean, 175,000 people are 90%. So that's not what it means. So it must mean that certain well-specified subgroups are not questions, but which are those? Anyway, what the paper does, it generates synthetic panels and very much follow with Bairoliya and Kruger's paper from 2007. It's just a fact that we all have to live with, that the US is so dominant in economic research that we're sort of more or less forced to compare to the United States. And as the authors show, is that consumption both in the US and in India show very clear inverted U-shape. While in India, when you adjust the demographic usage equivalent scales, it gets to be pretty flat. The paper mainly uses these synthetic panels, but also does some use of the panel, and in particular shows that savings follow a strong inverted U shape in India. So my overall take is that this is a very interesting set of stylized facts from a very impressive data set. It's actually very impressive. I hope to get some of my students to use it. So, but I do find that some of the interpretations could be quite a bit more clear. The comparison to the US is interesting, but I'm not sure why. Well, to my taste, I didn't really want to see all those tables, rather than like to jump down to the bottom point there, like to see the consumption profile next to the income profiles. Like, I would like to see a lot more of that. And yes, we should start with comparing to the US, but maybe not continue doing that. Okay, so that's a little bit to my taste. But the other thing is, if I had such a beautiful panel, I would consider it a little bit of a crime to turn it into a pseudo panel. So that's certainly nothing I have ever done. I've used pseudo panels wishing I had a panel, but that's the opposite. So fitting a model would obviously be the idea, and that can take many forms, right? It can be a stylized written down model, all the way to a more elaborate computable structural model. So data, I'm a little bit worried about what's consumption. So maybe maybe it's exact same in the PSID, but so it's non-durable consumption, that's what we call it, but it does include a lot of services. The thing that sort of made me stop and think about is I worry about rent, right? But not imputed rent. So if I pay rent and then I buy a house, does my consumption go down a lot? Because instead of paying to a landlord, I'm, in economic terms, paying to myself. So I'm a little worried, or I'd like to know a little bit about how much rent matters for these things. So in any event, the pseudo panel are constructed by aggregating observations from age groups. But a lot more detail should be given here. Like, I think you do that, you take like agriculture workers, and then you aggregate over wage groups, or urban, rural, rather than sort of the standard ways of generating cells that are split up by age and education or whatever, white collar. So it's not set, but that's what I think happens. Of course, it does make me wonder a bit. So what's a white collar worker over the life cycle? Are you a white collar worker at 24? Stay white collar worker till you're 70, or is it a different? If people are moving in and out, maybe it doesn't matter too much. But if early in the life cycle, there's very few of these white collar workers, and later in the life cycle, there's a lot of them, then selectivity starts to become a worry. So so that's one of the things I will.
Have we lost Bent? I can't hear anything.
Yeah, same here.
I can't either.
Is there a way to message him and let him know that?
Bent, we can't hear you.
Do you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I switched the microphone. I don't know what happened. So anyway, if we look at this regression here, like we regress consumption on a non-parametric shape in age, while we control for cohort, we control for time and epsilon. It's a very confusing notation. Alpha I, that looks like a fixed effect. I doubt that's what you mean. I think you just mean alpha. And for alpha t, you just mean beta. This is just one coefficient, right? Because as it's written, it doesn't make sense. So, but in any event, the linear terms in age is clearly not identified from cohort and time, because most of us, at least if we're lucky, get 1 year older every year. It does make me puzzle how you have all three coefficients in table 2. Something is fishy then. So, but anyway, that's just a minor technical point. Now, but what's a little more conceptual, right, is the identifying assumption that consumption is developing as a non-linearly in age, but linearly in time. Like for the US, it wouldn't worry me so much, but certain things that you might worry about in India is that India is growing so fast, right? So there's lots of things changing in India. So for a young person, I mean, your life cycle profile is sort of mixed together from what happens from older people and from younger people, right? Because your sample is so short that the younger people of low age are a separate group of people from people of a higher age. And the people who are born in India today, if they really were life cycle savers, and their expectation for future life cycle income would be a lot higher. So in any event, at least be explicit about that. So we fit a non-parametric curve, right? It sounds very fancy, but it's basically just a histogram that smoothed it out a bit. So I wouldn't try to make it sound so fancy, but that's a small thing. So Bairoliya and Crook, of course, are forced to use cross sections if they wanted to use the CEX. So with panel, you could do an awful lot more, I would think. Like you could easily show uncertainty around this average. You could do a direct estimation of the slope of income. You have the change in consumption here. I mean, you have the change in consumption. You observe people at T and T minus 1. It'd be from overlapping, but not, you don't have a whole life cycle. But that's implicit what you're doing anyway, right? That it's not the same people with the same future expectations in different parts of what you call the life cycle. So again, I spent quite a bit of time and thinking about, well, I do have this wonderful a panel here. So as I said, the fact that India is changing so much now, going from a poor country to a middle income country, is very different from the US. So in terms of the writing, some of it could be improved for the uninitiated. So it's really abstract. It talked about growth in consumption, and that confused me quite a lot. If you from the start say that you're basically looking at the peak over trough or something like that, or estimating the curvature of the life cycle profile, that would be easier. I mean, eventually you do say it, but I think that only shows up on page. So measurement error in head of household, that's just I mean, it's just a small thing, but what on earth does that mean? So in the US, the Census Bureau totally abandoned this term, right? Because it's kind of have a sort of a sexist ring to it, like, because it used to be the male, and so I would advise you to just avoid that. To just say, you know, we look at the main earner instead of whatever somebody has decided to call head of household. There's some discussion about who makes a financial decision. I don't. If you know anything about that, you should write a paper for a good journal. So the discussion there's a little confusion. So the canonical consumption model, I think you mean the PAH. The PAH. To me, I think the buffer stock model is actually more canonical at this stage. Most of us, if we write down models. Use models where people have a life cycle borrowing constraint, and which means where they're constrained in each period, but they can still adjust their assets. Maybe they can even borrow, but only to a fixed limit, and they can die with that. So in the buffer stock model, right, agents are impatient, but smooth transitory shocks in order to avoid running out of income and have zero consumption. So that model seems to possibly fit the data. And so in general, as I said, more about India and less about US would improve the paper. India consumption profile, income profiles, and again, I worry a little bit about these income profiles for young, having been very different from what were the income profiles from the older. So a third point, if this is written for a general audience, there's a lot of stuff we would like to know about. So like, what is the role of mortgages in India? So, I mean, that's gets to, like, I think what's the most interesting part of the paper, right? So it seems, and that seems fairly convincing, that that the life cycle profile has a lot to do with savings for houses, cars, large durables. So we sort of know in the US, it varies a little bit over time, right? But people basically can buy a house with like a 10% down payment, even though it depends a little bit on your credit score. I don't know anything about the housing market in India. Do you have to pay cash? That would certainly explain everything, right? But that's something that I think you could say a lot more about. Recourse, if you can mortgage your house and don't pay it, can people go after your other assets? There are all these things that I just don't know anything about. The same with car finance. In the US, you really don't need much down payment to buy a car. So do people in India buy cars later because of that? There's an interesting paper by, I think it's Capelli and Quarta, that they show, like in Italy, it's very hard to get after people if they don't pay. So people are just forced to, because of the reaction of the lenders, to buy durables, in particular houses, but that time out much later because you have to have much larger down payment. So you show this equation for savings around a big purchase, that's very hard to decipher. I guess that you're using, when you're doing this for housing, you're picking the sample only of people who buy a house. But you don't say so. But I think that's what you're doing. If you're doing something else, you should explain it. You should explain it anyway. So, so it seems to be standard event study with questions, but just take some journal finance and use the standard way of explaining this, because I was confused for a while. So an important thing underlying any rational expectation consumer model is the income process. So most models would predict that both the buffer stock model, the PH, are not different in that respect. They predict that persistent shocks, random walks, literally are not smoother at all. So what is the income structure in India? It's a hump shape, which probably is, but I don't know without being told. Income process predictable, or what's going on, right? We don't know anything about that, and you don't say much about it. Now, if you have a real panel, it's not very hard to estimate persistence. You know, it's a short panel, and that might be, or at least estimations are imperfect, but you can estimate persistence somewhere or other. So a lot of modern, well, recent papers in the US have resorted to just assuming that income is an exogenous process. And that kind of, again, about the structure of the Indian economy. In the US, it's actually quite hard to fire people. It's not like literally that you have laws against firing people, right? But anybody who gets fired can sue, and it's a big pain to do that. And therefore, employers are also very careful about hiring. Which makes it more reasonable that to say, well, income is more or less exogenous, given your income and this and that. But in India, people just jumping in and out of the labor market, is very easy to adjust your labor supply, in which case, well, then it becomes harder to interpret. We have this consumption profile that's inverse U-shaped, so it's an income profile. There's something people choose to do. Then what does that mean in terms of a model? I'm not saying necessarily you can answer all these questions in one paper, but anyway, this is what I was thinking about. Friedman showed, I guess that's probably what he got the Nobel Prize for, that consumption reacts to permanent shocks at permanent income hypothesis, while transitory shocks mainly aggregate out. Everybody knows that. But what motivated him was that to write this was that MPCs are much higher for aggregate data. What explains that? With a combination of aggregation and transitory shocks usually being IID across individuals, which means that when you aggregate out the transitory shocks. So that's something you choose to do by creating the pseudo panel. Was we wanted to see a bit more about how people are able to smooth. You could look at how consumption reacts to temporary transitory shocks. So I don't know. This is something that matters a lot if you wanted to estimate MPCs. In terms of estimating the hump in life cycle, consumption maybe doesn't matter so much, but it does matter for the way we interpret it, right? That we really want to know, well, are people able to borrow, or they're not able to borrow, and what is that, what explains it. So So what I think happens is that current income has a hump shape, and that's to a large extent exogenous. I think that's what happened, but that's I don't know. But I'm more convinced that most agents just consume their current income, at least on average. And then you see this much smoother Indian life cycle profile. Just because people have a hump-shaped income profile which is inherited by consumption, and then they have more children. So when you divide by these equivalent scale, it smoothes it out in the US much more than in America, because Americans have fewer children. If that's what happened, it's sort of mechanical. I mean, of course, some people would start to try and model endogenous fertility or that, but that's probably a second order thing. So I'm not sure it's so interesting to see all this flattening, because it seems to some extent mechanical, just because people have more children. What's more interesting, I think, is the savings for big durable items. So you do show one curve for savings, but that one you don't compare to the US. That would actually might be more interesting. So again, what's known about collateralized loans? If houses and cars cannot easily be used for collateral, you want a car, well, then you're stuck with having to save early on in order to build up, not enough money to buy the car, right? And but of course, again, some more structured modeling would be useful, because the thing is that's hard to kind of picture when you're not, when you sit here in America, is the people live in these extended families, and do the older people buy cars for the young people? Or that's a lot of stuff there that I wonder about. So now I'll sort of more loosely think about things that would be interesting to see. And as I have already indicated, it would be very nice to make more use of the panel structure. And as I said, you can estimate the slope by household instead of aggregate it all the way. I mean, what I'm saying, you aggregate the level and then you calculate the slope. What I'm saying is you could calculate the slope in the income, in the consumption profile, and then aggregate the slopes, right? To check what is the growth in consumption for each person, what is it on average? Of course, if you do that, you could also first control for all sorts of things. One of the things that I realized, I didn't write it down because only sort of really started thinking about it right now. What is it you do with these equivalent scales? I mean, what I would think that I would do is that I would calculate consumption equivalence for each household, and then I would aggregate. But now I actually suspect that you are aggregating, and then you are doing some equivalent scale popping in the average number of children for this group. Does it matter? I don't know, but you have the option to check that out. Now, equivalent scales are a little bit cheap. I mean, I use it myself, but I don't have a data set this enormous size, so you could actually estimate them yourself. Or you could simply say, well, we have all these data. What is a typical consumption for people with many few children? Which is sort of the same thing, except you're not pulling out an explicit functional form for the equivalent scale, and then you use the residual. So there are many ways in which you could make use of this panel data structure to try and do these adjustments at the household level before you aggregate things around. So I didn't put that down with the big
Bent, you're frozen. We can't hear you. We still can't hear you. I hope you can get back, Bent. Otherwise, Areendam and Neha will have to just read your slides. And
I think he has given us a lot to read about and think about.
that is true.
It's absolutely,
When we can see you moving the cursor, so we retain hope of hearing you again on the show.
Is it better now?
Yes.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, good. Sorry about that. Well, could be your fault. So, to any event, so now I'll speak a little faster. So maybe fit a structure model the next period, or fit a more statistical model to these patterns. So, as I said, you could try and calculate consumption growth as a function of income growth and age, or the covariance, children households. Be easy to do in the panel. There's a little bit we're doing table 2, which sort of sticks out a little bit from the paper, right? Because that sort of gets into the kind of paper that I sort of would have written. And then I would have showed less of these, I think, too many figures comparing US to India. Of course, there are various issues like causality. Is saving a function of the intention to buy a car? Is the intention to buy a car a function of a race, or somehow inherit some money, have some savings, and whatever, right? So could try and do two-stage least squares, DMM. What determines this desire? Do you have like exogenous changes in number of children, or approximately? So more modeling would be very interesting, but might be a second paper that I think you should write with this wonderful data set. So in general, let's see, there was a few things I was thinking of when I wrote it. I think I put more of them up. Yeah, so I mean, one of the ways to see how much it really is the demographic, like my second point here, is it sort of mechanical? What if you select a sample? You could even like technically match it to the US. People who have like the same demographic profile as in the US. And now we're keeping this constant, then do the two things look the same? But it does look to me like the main difference is that you have to finance housing, cars with savings. But that's where I really wanted to know about how is the typical purchase of these big ticket items done in India. So so I'm out of slides and out of time. So I'm glad I got my sample. So I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Ben. Thank you. That was very, very valuable.
Well, I hope you take it the right way. So twice in my life, people have gotten really angry with me because I criticized it, but it really was not. That's not the intention.
No, those are very useful.
Yeah. So do I have time to respond to maybe some?
Sure, you can. You can take your time. You can take advantage of Bent available over here. So Areendam has answered all the questions that came online. So that was well.
I tried my best. Yeah.
That's what well taken care of. And Neha, please respond to Bent Sorensen.
So Ben, first of all, thanks again. I think those were some really, really valuable comments, and it has given us a lot to think about. A few things that I wanted to kind of mention. So one is, your comment about why aren't we utilizing the panel structure more? We actually started thinking about that way. We started trying to estimate, panel models, fixed effects, random effects. The two reasons we gave up on those. First is they are computationally very intensive given the sample size that we have. But of course, that was not all of it. The second is, and I think this is where we need to think a little bit harder, is we did not know whether that's the right approach, like, whether we wanted to isolate all the fixed effect and just think about the growth over the age, because we wanted to first document these average profiles, which are also driven by different household types. And we wanted to think about what the growth looks like. And that's why the approach we took was like, we're looking at different subgroups and, seeing whether one group is different from the other. So we had really the fixed effects then kind of, if you think about in our framework, added in. But I think we need to think a little bit harder on how we can utilize this panel structure and also kind of, document what we are documenting. So that was a very good comment. The other question that I thought was very interesting is, we're saying that how savings rate changes around durable purchases, particularly house, and it could be that your rent is going down. So this is something that we can definitely very easily check. And I think we are going to check because we can net out the rental payments and just look at, expenditures and other things net of these payments and how they are changing. So that was, I think, was a very good comment. Related to the pseudo panels for different subgroups, yes, we'll try and make it clearer in the paper. We are estimating these things, separately for different subgroups. So when we say rural, we are collapsing our sample to only rural households, and then we are reconstructing these profiles and re-estimating everything. Your comment about, apologies about the bad notation in the equation. You're absolutely right. Your comment about the cohort time and age fixed effect about the identification is spot on. It's something that's very well known in the literature, and also about nonlinearity in timing potentially. So this is something we had to take a stance on because, again, you cannot identify there is perfect collinearity between age and cohort and time. So you have to make some judgment call. What we thought would be, at least the way to go in this paper, would be to have a flexible, parametric, non-parametric form for age, because that's the real object of interest, and really treat time and cohort dummies as standard. But in the case of India, the time dimension could be important. And hopefully 10 years from now, when we have 10 years more of data and when we can do more fancy things with the time dummies, my answer wouldn't change. We will subscribe to the latest version then, and we'll have all this 20 years of data, and hopefully I can give you the same answer. And some of your comment about transitory versus permanent shocks and marginal propensity to consume. So we actually, Areendam and I, with another graduate student, we have follow-up work on that. We definitely think that is something very interesting to explore further. And so we are definitely thinking about along those lines. But I will spend more time looking at all your comments in detail, and you've given us a lot to think about. So thank you so much.
Thank you again, Bent. Yeah, and I think Neha has answered the questions very well.
I'll send you the
yes, please.
And if you do these other papers, please send them to me. As I said, it looks like a potentially reach mind to mind this data set.
I have a request. Neha, if you could please share your slides with us, we'll make them available for people who would like to come and see them later. Ben, the same request to you as well. If you could send your slides to us. And to all of you, this will be available on the CMI YouTube channel. So all your students can come and see this and learn from this as well. And the questions and answers will also be put up. We'll be happy to help you with anything else that you would like from us. Do remain in touch with us for all the new research you do. We'll be happy to host you again. Thank you to all the people who have attended this webinar, and we look forward to inviting you to more again for more similar webinars. Thank you, Bent, very much for an excellent discussion paper, and thank you, Areendam and Neha, for a lovely presentation.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot, Mahesh.
Yeah, thanks for
Thank you,
putting this
Mahesh and
together.
Preetha, for doing this. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.